Continuing major trends in Jewish mysticism by Gershom G. Scholem. We are in Hasidism, the latest phase. I'm not sure what sentence we're at, but nor were the Orthodox squeamish about the means that were employed in this struggle. As late as 1800 of the Common Era, fanatical opponents of the Hasidim tried to influence the Russian government to take action against it. The history of these organized persecutions and of the Hasidic defense against them has been fully described by Simeon Dubnow. There can be no doubt that the Hasidim cherished a feeling of moral superiority over their contemporaries, which has found expression in the writings of some famous Hasidic authors. One could easily make a collection of Hasidic epigrams which breathe a spirit not very far removed from that of Sabbatianism. The Hasidic tzaddik, too, is occasionally compelled to descend to a lower or even dangerous plane in order to rescue the scattered sparks of light. For every descent of the tzaddik means an elevation of divine light. And yet Hasidism did not go the way of Sabbatianism. Its leaders were far too closely connected with the life of the community to succumb to the danger of sectarianism. Opportunities were not lacking, yet these men, whose utterances not infrequently throw more light on the paradoxical nature of the mystical consciousness than anything before them, became supreme paradox, the advocates of the simple and untainted belief of the common man. And this simplicity was even glorified by them as the highest religious value, so profound an intellect as Rabbi Nachman of Braslav, a man whose Kabbalistic terminology hides an almost hyper-modern sensitiveness to problems, turned all his energy to the task of defending the simplest of all beliefs. The fact is that from the beginning, the Baal Shem, the founder of Hasidism, and his followers were anxious to remain in touch with the life of the community, and to this contact they assigned an special value. The paradox which they had to defend, that of the mystic in the community of men, was of a different nature than that upon which the Sabbateans took their stand, and which inevitably gave a destructive turn to all their endeavors, salvation through betrayal. The greatest saints of Hasidism, the Baal Shem himself, Levi Isaac Berdikzel, Jacob Isaac, the seer of Lublin, Moshe Leib of Sasav, and others, were also its most popular figures. They loved the Jews, and their mystical glorification of this love did not decrease, but rather added to its socially effective influence. It is not surprising, rather the contrary, that these men did everything in their power to avoid a conflict with a Judaism they intended to reform from within, and where it could not be avoided, to blunt its edge. Hasidism, in fact, solved the problem, at least as far as Judaism was concerned, of establishing so close a relation between the pneumatic, that is to say, the man who feels himself inspired in every act by a transcendental power, the pneuma, our spirit, and the religious community, that the inevitable tension between them helps to enrich the religious life of the community, instead of destroying it. The fact that this possession of superior faculties, this pneumatic character, became an establishment, as it did in later Tzaddikism, after the holy fire had burnt down, is merely the reverse side of this positive achievement of Hasidism. Had the typical tzaddik been a sectarian or a hermit, and not what he was in fact, namely the center of the community, such an establishment could never have grown up, safeguarding as it did a distinctive form of religious life, even after the spirit had departed, or, even worse, been commercialized. In this connection, a further point must be kept in mind. Classical Hasidism was not the product of some theory or other, not even of a Kabbalistic doctrine, but of direct, spontaneous religious experience, since the men who met with this special experience were, for the most part, simple and unsophisticated, the form in which they expressed their ideas and feelings was somewhat primitive compared to the older Kabbalah, which reflected something of the complicated ambiguity of its subject. This is why we find a far more definitive pantheistic tinge in the formulation of the thoughts of the first Hasidic thinkers than ever before. Probably under the influence of this fact, Solomon Schechter defined the doctrine of God's immanence in all things not only as the very root and core of Hasidism, but as its distinguishing characteristic. It is permissible to doubt this, as has been shown in some of the previous lectures. The same doctrine had been expounded long before by some of the great Jewish mystics and Kabbalists. To me, not the doctrine seems new, but rather the primitive enthusiasm with which it was expounded and the truly pantheistic exhilaration evoked by the belief that God surrounds everything and pervades everything. It was this which so deeply shocked the Gaon of Vilna, who, nevertheless, was an ardent Kabbalist himself. The Hasidim, on their part, accused him of having misunderstood the doctrine of Tzimtzum, and through a misplaced literal interpretation arriving at a false idea of an absolute transcendence of God, a real abyss between God and creation. To the Hasid, at least during the early period of the movement, the Tzimtzum is much more a symbol of our natural self than a real occurrence in God. In other words, it is nothing real at all. A ray of God's essence is present and perceptible everywhere and at every moment. Gradually, it is true, with the growth and spread of the movement, and in the measure in which it became detached from the primitive environment of Padalia and was joined by more learned and sophisticated minds, the old radicalism began to wane. Compromises were sought and found, and gradually Hasidism learned to speak a language which no longer shocked the Orthodox. For the rest of the Hasidim, for whom it was a commonplace that the Torah is the law of the Jewish people and the cosmic law of the universe, had never by their actions transgressed the limits of Orthodox Judaism, at least not in principle. Such apparent heresies as the elimination of fixed hours of prayer and similar acts which sprang from the unbounded enthusiasm of individual Stoicism clashed sharply enough with certain passages of the codes of religious law, but did not amount to anything like a real conflict between the Torah in the heart and the written Torah. The fact is that Hasidism represents, throughout, a curious mixture of conservatism and innovation. Its attitude towards tradition is somewhat dialectical. Thus, when a great Tzaddik was asked why he did not follow the example of his teacher in living as he did, he replied, "On the contrary, I do follow his example, for I leave him as he left his teacher." The tradition of breaking away from tradition produced such curious paradoxes. Now, you don't have to break away from the alleged scripture to break away from the traditions about that scripture, because you can distinguish that. But if you really are to reform society, you don't just step away and live in, try to figure out how to be a wandering, live on the land person. You want to affect people here and there. And sometimes that requires being in the mode of involvement in the community. 6. Consideration must finally be given to another point. This is the close connection between mysticism and magic throughout the history of the Hasidic movement. It is as though the personality of Israel Baal Shem Tov, had been created solely for the purpose of confusing the modern theorists of mysticism. Here you have a mystic whose authentic utterances permit no doubt as to the mystical nature of his religious experience, and whose earlier and later followers have resolutely taken the same path, and yet he is also a true Baal Shem, that is to say, a master of the great name of God, a master of practical Kabbalism, a magician. Unbroken confidence in the power of the holy names bridges the gap in his consciousness between the magician's claim to work miracles with his amulet or through other magical practices, and the mystical enthusiasm which seeks no object but God. At the end of the long history of Jewish mysticism, these two tendencies are as closely interwoven as they were in the beginning, and in many of the intermediate states of its development, the revival of a new mythology in the world of Hasidism, to which attention has been drawn occasionally, especially by Martin Buber, draws not the least part of its strength from its connections between the magical and the mystical faculties of its heroes. When all is said and done, it is this myth which represents the greatest creative expression of Hasidism. In the place of the theoretical disquisition, or at least side by side with it, you get the Hasidic tale around the lives of the great tzaddikim, the bearers of that irrational something which their mode of life expressed. Legends were spun often in their own lifetime. Triviality and profundity, traditional or borrowed ideas, and true originality are indissolubly mixed in this overwhelming wealth of tales which play an important part in the social life of the Hasidim. To tell a story of the deeds of the saints has become a new religious value, and there is something of the celebration of religious rite about it. Not a few great tzaddikim, above all, Rabbi Israel of Rishon, the founder of the Eastern Galician Hasidic dynasty, have laid down the whole treasure of their ideas in such tales. Their Torah took the form of an inexhaustible fountain of storytelling. Nothing at all has remained theory. Everything has become a story. And so perhaps I may also be permitted to close these lectures by telling you a story of which the subject, if you like, is the very history of Hasidism itself. And here it is, as I have heard it told by that great Hebrew novelist and storyteller S.J. Agnon. When the Baal Shem had a difficult task before him, he would go to a certain place in the woods, light a fire, and meditate in prayer. And what he had set out to perform was done. When a generation later the Maggid of Mezeritz was faced with the same task, he would go to the same place in the woods and say, "We can no longer light the fire, but we can still speak the prayers." And what he wanted done became a reality. Again, a generation later, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sasov had to perform this task, and he too went in the woods and said, "We can no longer light the fire, nor do we know the secret meditations belonging to the prayer, but we know the place in the woods to which it all belongs, and that must be sufficient," and sufficient it was. But when another generation had passed, and Rabbi Israel of Rishon was called upon to perform the task, he sat down on his golden chair in his castle and said, "We cannot light the fire, we cannot speak the prayers, we do not know the place, but we can tell the story of how it was done." And the storyteller adds, the story which he told had the same effect as the actions of the other three. You can say, if you will, that this profound little anecdote symbolizes the decay of a great movement. You can also say that it reflects the transformation of all its values, a transformation so profound that in the end, all that remained of the mystery was the tale. That is the position in which we find ourselves today, or in which Jewish mysticism finds itself. The story is not ended. It has not yet become history, and the secret life it holds can break out tomorrow in you or in me. Under what aspects this invisible stream of Jewish mysticism will again come to the surface, we cannot tell. But I have come here to speak to you of the main tendencies of Jewish mysticism as we know them, to speak of the mystical course which, in the great cataclysm, now stirring the Jewish people more deeply than in the entire history of exile, destiny may still have in store for us, and I, for one, believe that there is such a course is the task of prophets, not of professors. And there's a further meaning in that, isn't there? Isn't there the meaning of as much guidance as you have? If you truly go upon the guidance, that will be enough. And perhaps no further, right? But the abbreviations that we have, RM is Rhea, Mahemna, REJ, Review, Des Etudes, Juives, MGWJ, Montage Schrift, für Geschichte und Wissenschaft des Judentums, JTU JHS, Jewish Theological Seminary, JE, Jewish Encyclopedia, JQR, Jewish Quarterly Review, HUCA, Hebrew Union College Annual, EG, Encyclopedia Judica, and I am going to attempt, as we turn to the notes, to not only comment further about the notes, but to say stuff regarding, post-Holocaust, modern New Age Jewish movements, stuff like that. I may not have as much insight as other people, but so we're still in notes to lecture 2. In 50, the correct reading has been given and interpreted by my colleague Johannan Louis in Tarbiz, volume 12, 1941, page 164. Damiel says to the Gnostic, Aristhan Hameran Aristhan Yukhan, or rather, if the text is properly corrected, Tukhan Fahnan Sah Myron Sah My on Ir Hanha. Instead of Samnash, one should read Samiyun. If the proper graphical changes are made, the phrase now reads, best day, best luck, show me your sign, beats the seal, peace. Thereupon, i.e. after he has set the seal, Damiel receives him in the friendliest manner and sits down next to him on a bench of pure stone, chapter 19n. Such remains of the Greek formula are to be found also in 5 other places. Hiklut, Rabti, Damiel. Another various curious detail was apparently conceived originally as ruler of the 4 elements, chapter 18:6. Upon the first mention of Damiel and the seal which is to be shown to him, acts. Is he called Damiel? Is not his name Abir Gedrahim? This is interpreted by Louis, rightly as I think, as an only slightly corrupted transcription of the Greek names of the 4 elements: Aher, air; Gah, earth; Udor, ador, water; Pur, fire. Abir is the common Palestinian transcription of Awir, Aher, as Saul Lieberman, Yerushalmi, Kup Shuthu. 1, page 221 has shown him thus in the manuscript of JTHS in New York, instead of Yaham of the editor Jelinek, is a graphically easily explained variation of here, which is not the same thing as in Sufi terminology, or is it? Could that be where it comes from? Like sacred fire or something. 51. This has been justly stressed by G.H. Box in his introduction to R.H. Charles's translation of the Ascension of Isaiah of 1919, page 22. In 4 Ezra 7, 90 to 98, we find a description of 7 ways or stages apportioned to souls after death. 52. Haggadah 12b, following a tradition dating from the 3rd century of the Common Era. Reyut Yitzchakal, published by, note 53 is published by Jacob Mon and Yisrael Hetsupa Lech Kamat Yisrael 5, 1921, page 256 to 267. Price and Duns has published in Greek Papyri Graka, volume 2, 1931, page 160. The inscription of an amulet from the 5th century, which seems to reflect Jewish ideas. Here we find the names of 6 heavens and the respective archons. '54, in his book, which appeared in 1912, Abelson paid no attention to the Kabbalistic conceptions of the Shekinah. '55, Odeberg, Third Enoch, introduction, page 106, quotes Hikulut, Rebti, chapter 26, Ata der Bulb Hadam. But the correct reading is Ata Dalet Resh Bulabat Dinurin Wash Lah Biyut. Manuscript David Kaufman, 238 in Budapest, and Manuscript New York, a Jewish Theological Seminary, 828. 56, Hiklut, Vrabti, chapter 14, in the Berita Dem Asha Brashit. Brashit is the name for Genesis. We encounter some attempts to give a closer description of this intersection of the 7 heavens and the 7 earths. 57. Zaharial is quite common in the greater Hekaloth, corrupted into Zebudial and Zeburial. Akaturial is to be found already in Barakoth 7a. Yerun occurs in the Lesser Hekaloth manuscript Munich 22, folio 136a. Their meaning is quite obvious. The full formula consists always of the mystical name plus Yud Yud Alhi Yisrael. Yud, of course, being the representation of Yahweh. God is a noun and verb. 58. Thuth Rusia, or the Thrusia, is very common in the Hekaloth text. It corresponds exactly to names like Arthathiao in the Papyri Graeca Magica. Maybe that first TH is a D, because that looks like a 6, so maybe that's supposed to be a D. Or maybe that's supposed to be a B, because it loops. It doesn't look like it's printed right. But the Greek magician uses the Hebrew word arbat, whereas the Jewish mystic uses the Greek term tetros, similar to the predilection for Greek formula mentioned in note 50. 50, we have Semek, Merkaba, Sholyama, 1b, Shri, Gawah, Wira, Warad, 60, the same, especially Hiklut, Rebti, chapters 3 and 4, 7 through 10, 24 to 26, and the prayers, hymns, which are printed at the end of Super Ritual, Amsterdam, 1701, folio 37 to 40. Moreover, there is a great deal of unpublished material of this genre. 61, Rudolf Otto, The Idea of the Holy, translated by John W. Harvey, 1923, chapter 6. I haven't shared that one on the channel. I remember that book. Maybe I should share of it at some point. 62, Philip Bloch, in Monteschrift für Geschichte und Wissenschaft des Judentum, Volume 37, 1893, page 259. 63 is located in page 306. 64, note 64, Eleazar of Worms calls it Shirt Hum Lakim. In Naphtali Trevis's commentary on the prayer book, Tingen 1560 is where you find reference to that. Hiklut Rubti, chapter 26, altered in a few places in accordance with better readings in the manuscript, is where note 65 derives from. Bloke's citation of 200 of page 259 is note 66. Note 67, Hiklut Rubti, chapter 24. 68 has been proved in detail, particularly by Bloke, in his above-mentioned article on the subject. 69, Megala 18a, and Barakoth 33b, block located site page 262 FF. He overlooked the passage in J. Burkoth v. at the end of the Halakha 3. Bethitha Ashtatik Baupniya, which of course is not a later addition, as Bloke has contended in his essay Ram Andai Mystikar der Merkaba Fettschrift für J. Gutman, 1915, page 113. See also Hilun 91b on the Prayer of the Angels, called Ophanim. 71, Apocalypse of Abraham, chapters 17 and 18. The passage quoted from the Greater Hekaloth at the beginning of chapter 9. Kakol Mim Brash Naharut Kugli Tershish Shuruch Durumit Thurdat Bahan. For comparison of the prayers in the so-called Liturgy of Mithras and the Prayer of the Primordial Man to the Father of Light in chapter Bain's Coptic Gnostic Treatise, 1933, page 26 to 36. 73, thus for the instance of the words Zihyun, splendor, Zigub, exaltation. 74, of the text in Bauer's Abudat Yishral, page 547 to 552. Moses Teku, note 75 comes from Moses Teku in Katab Tamim, quoted by Bar, page 547, contends that the heretics forged it. Now, of course, when we refer to that, are we talking about the writings section of the Bible? 76, Beth Ha-Midrash, volume 3, page 161 to 863, manuscript 827 of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, includes this piece as part of the text of Hiklut Rubti, the throne mysticism of Ezekiel, certain things that you don't really find in the literature of mystical reenactment has certainly become more common in these days. Guided meditations of all sorts. 77, this is not a verse from the Bible, but a formula of Merkabah mystics. Perki Hiklut, editor Wertheimer, chapter 31, where the text is deficient but can be completed from early quotations of this passage, such as Naphtali Trevis in his commentary to Barku in the morning prayer. 78, Muscat Hiklut 7 in Beth Ha-Midrash, volume 2, 45, 3, Enoch chapter 48, Odeberg, page 155. 955 is the number value of the word Heshmim, the final meme representing the number 600. Another theory on the 390 heavens in Mesaketh Derek Ertz, edited by Hager, page 294. Arugut Hubsham, editor Erbach, page 212. And Azrael Pirush Hagdut, editor Tishby, page 46. 79 refers to the Hiklut Rebti, chapters 18.4 and 21.3. 80 Hiklut Zuthrati, manuscript of Oxford, 1531, folio 45b. Hal Shahwa Nalam Magani Kol Habriut 1 Sutter Mum Laki Heart 1 Gala Lu Lur. Is that Resh? Akyaba Bum Asha Merkaba. Merkaba is like a vehicle. Rukab is, like a ride. So having quality of the ride. 81, the title has been frequently translated as measure of the height. Kuma, being used in the biblical sense. This is wrong. Koma is here used in the sense that it has the Aramaic incantation text, where it simply signifies body. Well, is Kum what's before you? 82. Solomon ben Yeruhim in his Semek Multmut Hay, edited Davidson, 1939, page 114 to 124. Maimonides' responsum in Teshjubut Hermub Meme, editor Freeman, page 343. Moses Taku in Otzer Nehmad 3, page 62. And I guess that's where we're going to leave off.